You think I'm paying $45,000 for your spa trip? The words hit the table harder than my voice ever could. Clarissa blinked once, slow, like she'd just been challenged in her own house. Then the smile came. Shold. You can pack your dusty little life and stay out of ours. For a second, I didn't breathe. Ethan didn't either. He stared at the bread basket like it might save him. I'd heard cruel words before. But coming from across my own table, from a woman who'd married into my family, they carved deeper than I expected. She didn't just want the money. She wanted the win. Her gaze locked on me, waiting for the crack. The apology, the backtrack, it wasn't coming. I said no. No rise in tone, no explanation, just 2 words that felt heavier than years of keeping peace. Ethan's fork clicked against his plate. Still no eye contact. That silence was its own betrayal. Clarissa leaned back, eyes bright with the kind of triumph only bullies recognize. Some of us, she said, plan to enjoy life while we can. I almost laughed. Enjoy life. On someone else's back. My back. In that instant, I understood. This wasn't about a spy in Sedona. It was about writing me out. Making sure the old woman with the quiet life stayed quiet. Not happening. I stood. Her smile didn't move. But her eyes did. A flicker, quick and telling. She didn't expect defiance. Enjoy Sedona, I said, and left it there, no blessing. No bridge left to cross. Ethan shifted, maybe to speak, but stopped. Whatever he would have said was gone before it reached the air. I walked toward the door without hurry, because the war wasn't in the hallway or the porch. It was here, in the fact that I wouldn't beg. Not today. Not ever again. Folks, if your family told you to get out of their lives, would you fight for your place, or let them slam the door for good? I didn't go far that afternoon, just enough to breathe without tasting her words. My steps slowed at the corner. I wasn't running from them. I was stepping out of reach. The difference mattered to me. The street was quiet, but my mind wasn't. It replayed every second at the table, each one heavier than the last. Her voice, his silence. I'd thought losing my husband was the hardest silence I'd ever endure. I was wrong. The silence from your own child carves in places you didn't know existed. I kept seeing Ethan's hands, still careful, as if moving might make him choose. And he had chosen. He'd chosen stillness, which was the same as standing with her. I wondered when that shift happened. Was it gradual? Or did I miss one single moment when loyalty slipped away? The not knowing hurt almost as much as the truth. Memories rose without asking. Ethan at 12, standing in my shop, glazing his first clay bowl. He'd been proud of it, too proud to sell it. I kept it on my kitchen shelf for years. Now I wasn't sure if it meant anything to him at all. The ache in my chest tightened, not from the wine stain, though I could still feel it, but from the realization that home was no longer neutral ground. It was a place where I could be pushed out without warning. I reached my own gate. The adobe walls stood the same as ever, but I felt like a guest on my own property. Inside, I knew the air would still smell faintly of sage from the morning. I wasn't ready to walk back into that. Instead, I stayed outside, fingers brushing the rough wood of the fence. I thought of the years I'd built without help, the ones where I woke before dawn, loaded boxes into a van, and kept moving until the day paid for itself. I hadn't forgotten how to stand on my own. They had just forgotten that I could. The longer I stood there, the clearer it became. Clarissa's outburst wasn't impulsive. It was a test. And Ethan's silence told her she'd passed. That knowledge settled in my stomach like cold stone. I wasn't just unwelcome. I was expendable. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It's the quietest place to plan from. I turned the key in the gate and stepped inside. Not to retreat, to remember. The house felt different when I stepped back in. Not quieter, just hollow, like something essential had slipped out. I hung my sweater over the chair, the stain dark against the cream. For a moment, I stared at it, wondering if it would ever wash out. Some marks aren't meant to. I made tea without thinking, hands moving through motions older than this house. Boil, pour. Wait, I'd done it 1,000 times for my husband after long days at the shop. Those evenings had weight and warmth. This one had neither. The first sip was hot enough to sting, and I let it. Better that than the ache in my chest. Pain you choose feels different from pain handed to you. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the grain in the wood with my thumb. It was the same table where Ethan once spilled orange juice all over his homework and cried because he thought I'd be angry. I wasn't. We cleaned it up together. I wish mistakes between us were still that easy to fix. The clock on the wall ticked steady. I used to love that sound. It meant time was moving forward. Now it felt like it was counting down. I thought about Clarissa's eyes when she said those words. There was no hesitation, no shame. She wanted me to hear every syllable, to understand my place. And she believed my place was nowhere near her life. The thing is, she didn't know my life before her. She'd never seen me negotiate contracts in my pottery business or turn a bad deal into a profitable one. She didn't know the years I spent building something people said would fail, and she certainly didn't know what I still owned. That ignorance was her weakness. I could feel the ember from earlier, steady now, not flickering. It didn't matter how she saw me. It mattered how I saw myself. I finished the tea and set the cup down gently, not because I was calm, but because calm is what she'd never expect. Upstairs, the box of old papers waited in my closet. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were contracts, deeds, letters, reminders of the life I'd made, and maybe, just maybe, the key to writing the next chapter on my own terms. I didn't move toward it yet. Some moments are better when they build quietly. 3 days passed before I saw Clarissa again, long enough for the air to settle, but not for me to forget. It was at a neighborhood brunch, hosted by a mutual acquaintance. I almost didn't go. But staying away would look like surrender, and I wasn't ready to hand her that. The room was warm with small talk and the smell of coffee. I'd barely reached the buffet when I heard her voice. "Marjorie," she called out, sugar dripping from every syllable. Heads turned. I smiled, keeping mine steady, and walked toward her. She stood near a cluster of women, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a glossy magazine. Clarissa didn't wait for me to reach her. She turned to them and said, "Marjorie's got such quaint habits. Still clipping coupons, aren't you?" The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. A couple of women shifted uncomfortably. One looked at her shoes. I felt my face heat, but I kept my voice even. "It's called knowing value, Clarissa. Some of us still practice it." Her smile froze just enough for me to see the crack. But she recovered quickly, patting my arm like I was a child. Oh, of course. Old habits die hard. The group chuckled politely, eager to smooth the moment. Clarissa had planted her seed, and she knew it. I didn't bite. Let her think I'd taken the blow. Sometimes silence speaks louder than the best retort. But inside, I was measuring the weight of her words. They weren't just for me. They were for the audience. She wanted them to see me as outdated, small, irrelevant. It worked in the short term. I could feel the shift in the air, that subtle change when people recalibrate how they see you. It's a skill bullies have, turning perception with a single jab. I finished filling my plate and found a seat near the window. From there, I could watch her without looking like I was. She moved easily from group to group, always laughing just a little too loud. Every so often, she'd glance my way. Not to check on me, just to confirm I was still in the room. Present, but sidelined. That's when I realized something important. Clarissa thrived on control, but more than that, she thrived on an audience. Without one, her power dulled. And if she needed an audience to win, I could choose where and when she got one. I ate slowly, letting the noise of the room wash over me. From my seat, I could see Clarissa holding court, her gestures polished, her laughter well-timed. She caught my eye once and lifted her glass as if in a toast. It was the kind of move that says, "I'm winning," without a single word. A woman I knew from years ago slid into the seat beside me. She glanced toward Clarissa. "Seems she's making friends?" she murmured. "Seems," I replied, keeping my tone light, but the word felt heavier in my mouth. Clarissa drifted closer with 2 women in tow. "Oh, Marjorie," she began. "I was just telling them how dedicated you are to your little pottery hobby." Little. She made it sound like a pastime for someone killing time before the end. The truth was, that hobby once paid for the roof over her head. One of the women smiled politely. The other looked away. Clarissa waited for me to play along, to laugh at myself. I didn't. "I built a business from that hobby," I said evenly. "Sold it for more than most people make in a decade." The silence after was brief, but I felt it. Her lips tightened before the smile returned. "That's wonderful, dear." "Really?" Then she turned to the women. "Isn't it sweet when people keep busy?" They laughed softly. And just like that, she'd shifted the frame again. She was good. Too good to push back against in front of her chosen audience. I finished my coffee, letting her words hang in the air. I'd learned long ago that sometimes the best counter isn't immediate. It's deliberate. When the brunch wound down, I stayed seated until most had left. Clarissa made a point of kissing my cheek on the way out. The scent of her perfume lingered longer than the touch. Outside, the autumn light was fading. I stood for a moment, watching her glide toward her car, coat swinging just so. She looked untouchable. For now, walking home, I thought about the way she moved pieces around the board, insults wrapped in compliments, demeaning stories told with a laugh, always in public, always with witnesses. It wasn't just about humiliating me. It was about shaping how others saw me, erasing the parts that didn't fit her story. By the time I reached my door, one thing was clear. If she wanted the stage, I'd let her have it, because when the lights turned, she'd never see me coming. Ethan called 2 days later, voice too casual to be casual. "Mom, I'll stop by this afternoon. There's something we should go over." He arrived with a leather folder tucked under his arm. No Clarissa this time. That almost made me more suspicious. We sat at the kitchen table. He opened the folder and slid a stack of papers toward me. "Just some updates on the accounts," he said. The top page was covered in numbers, columns neatly printed, but my name wasn't where it used to be. It was smaller, pushed to the side, almost like a footnote. I looked up at him. "What exactly am I looking at?" "Nothing complicated," he said quickly. "Just consolidating things, making it easier to manage." "Easier for who?" The question stayed in my mind, unspoken. I skimmed the pages. Some account balances were lower than they should have been. One in particular, an investment fund I hadn't touched in years, was down by more than a withdrawal or two. I set the papers down, keeping my voice steady. "Why is this fund short $20,000? He didn't blink. "Oh, I moved some of it temporarily. For liquidity." "Liquidity?" I repeated. The word tasted wrong in my mouth. And when exactly was I supposed to be informed? He shifted in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table. "I'm telling you now?" For a moment, I just looked at him. This was the boy I'd raised. The boy who once refused to take $5 from me without paying it back. Now he was moving money in my name without asking.
"What do you need me to sign?"
I asked finally. His eyes lit with a flicker of relief. "Just this acknowledgement. It formalizes the new structure." I read every word, letting the silence stretch. The document didn't just formalize anything, it reduced my access, funneled authority to him. I slid it back across the table. "No." He tried to laugh. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making it hard," I said. "I'm keeping it honest." The air between us tightened. For a second, I saw something in his face, frustration, maybe even guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He gathered the papers, tucking them back into the folder. "Think about it," he said, standing. "I already have," I replied. When he left, the house felt colder than it had in weeks. Not because of the temperature, but because something had shifted again. Money wasn't just money. It was leverage, and now I knew he was willing to use it. I watched from the window as Ethan's car backed away, blinkers ticking. The red lights turned a corner and vanished, but the pressure stayed. My hand stayed on the sill, steadying what the talk had shaken. It was not the folder I kept seeing. It was his careful face, composed to the point of cruelty, the calm of someone who had already decided. He had decided. About my money. About my place. About what I was supposed to sign without question. I moved back to the table and sat. The chair remembered me. I did not recognize myself. A cup he left still held a faint ring on the saucer. I pushed it away as if distance removed the aftertaste. For years I trusted Ethan with more than balances. I trusted him with the story of who I was and who he could be. Today he handed me a script with fewer lines and smaller font, and called it easier. Easier for whom was never said aloud. I heard it anyway. I opened the drawer where I keep my papers. Familiar envelopes, my handwriting, the stubborn dignity of ink. I did not need spectacle, only clarity. Page by page, I let the numbers sharpen. Here was a date I remembered. Here was one I did not. A transfer justified by error. A signature I knew was mine, yet attached to a choice I never made. Anger rose, then settled like sand in water. Rage is loud, resolve is quiet. I chose quiet. I breathed until the tremor left my hands. There was a time I could hold a ledger and feel the truth inside it. That muscle had gone soft from peace, not from weakness. It could be rebuilt. Life taught me that twice, once when I began, again when I survived loss. I thought about calling the bank. The phone sat within reach, heavy with possibilities and mistakes. Impulse would mark me as erratic. Clarity would mark me as inevitable. I kept my hands on my lap and listened to the room settle. Upstairs, behind winter coats, waits a box of my past. Deeds, contracts, letters written in a steadier decade. Proof that I did not dream the life I built. I pictured the lid, the label, the edges softened by time. I let the picture hold me still. Not yet, I told myself. Preparation deserves respect. Downstairs, the clock marked another minute. Not a loss, a boundary. I poured new tea and watched the steam rise like a promise I could keep to myself. The cup warmed my palms until my skin loosened. I drank slowly, owning the pace, owning the small mercy of choosing it. I was not afraid of smaller accounts. I was afraid of smaller permission. What was mine had become negotiable by someone who once asked for $5 with shy eyes and a plan to pay it back. That memory hurt with tenderness. Tenderness is not permission. By the time the cup was empty, the decision was not dramatic. It was simple and therefore strong. I would learn every line again. I would trace every flow until it led me to the hand that opened the valve. I would restore what had been moved without me. And I would do it without raising my voice, without warning, without hurry. I carried the empty cup to the sink and set it down. The soft click sounded like agreement from the room. I stood there a long moment, feeling my name grow back to its full size, letter by letter, inside my own mind. Ready? Clarissa didn't raise her voice after that night. She didn't need to. The silence she built around me was louder than any insult. Suddenly, I wasn't invited to Sunday dinners. I found out about Ethan's promotion from a neighbor, not my own son. I'd pass by their house on my morning walks and see cars in the driveway, hear faint bursts of laughter spilling through the windows. No one ever waved me in. Each time, I told myself it was just bad timing, but deep down I knew better. Ethan's texts grew shorter, colder. Busy today, Mom? Or worse, no reply at all. I used to be the first call he made when something happened. Now, I was an afterthought if I was thought of at all. The only light in those weeks was Sophie. She'd sneak over after school, her backpack still hanging off one shoulder. "Grandma, I saved you a cookie," she'd whisper as if kindness had to be smuggled in. We'd sit in my kitchen, nibbling at that one cookie, her swinging her legs under the chair while telling me about a science project or a new friend. I listened like it was oxygen. But even Sophie started to watch the clock. She'd glance at her phone, her smile faltering. "They'll be looking for me," she'd say, and slip out the door before anyone could see. It wasn't her fault. She was just a child caught between loyalty and love. Nights were the worst. The house felt bigger, colder. I'd sit at the table with my tea, staring at the empty chair across from me. That was where Frank used to sit, grumbling about the news or making me laugh at his terrible puns. Now it was just me and the hum of the refrigerator. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for where I'd gone wrong. Was I too honest with Clarissa? Too unwilling to bend? But each time I circled back to the same truth. Respect shouldn't be something you have to beg for. Sometimes, I'd hear a car slow down outside, and my heart would lift for a second. Maybe it was Ethan ready to talk, but the sound would fade and I'd feel that little drop inside me again. Hope shrinking just a bit more. Still, I kept my head up in public. At the grocery store, I smiled at the cashier, made small talk about the weather. No one needed to know how hollow it felt to walk back to a house that didn't feel like a home anymore. And yet, somewhere under the ache, a small voice started to whisper, "You've been here before. You've built a life from nothing before. You can do it again." I didn't know it then, but that whisper was the start of something that would change everything. By the second week, the pattern was set. If there was a gathering, I wasn't told. If I appeared, it was treated like an inconvenience. They didn't have to slam a door in my face. Keeping it closed was enough. One afternoon, I saw them in the park from a distance. Ethan, Clarissa, Sophie. They were sitting on a blanket, passing sandwiches, laughing at something I couldn't hear. I stood there for a moment, unnoticed. The sun caught in Sophie's hair, and my heart ached in two directions: love for her, and loss for the space I no longer occupied. I turned away before they could see me. The walk home felt longer than usual. The quiet in my house met me at the door like an old habit. Mail piled on the kitchen counter, mostly bills and advertisements. No handwritten envelopes, no notes, just to check in. I sorted through them slowly, as if dragging out the task might make the day last longer. The phone rang once that week. It was a wrong number. I almost wished they'd called back, just so there'd be another voice in the room. Even Sophie's visits grew rare. When she came, she spoke in shorter bursts, glancing toward the window as though someone might appear to call her home. Once, she hugged me quickly and whispered, "I'll try to come more." I nodded and told her not to worry, but the space after she left seemed to grow wider each time. In the evenings, I kept the television on just for company. Not to watch, just to hear someone speaking into the air. I found myself talking back sometimes, as though the anchor on the news might answer. Still, beneath the ache, something else began to stir. It was faint at first, like the thin light before dawn. But it was there. I started making small listed accounts to review, names of people I trusted, things I still owned outright. I told myself it was just to keep my mind active, but I knew better. When I lay in bed at night, I replayed years of choices. The sacrifices I'd made for Ethan. The way I'd built a foundation so he'd never have to start from nothing. And how quickly that foundation was now being chipped away. I thought of Frank again. How he'd once told me, the easiest way to lose something is to believe it's safe. At the time, I thought he meant money. Now I understood he meant trust. By the end of that month, the isolation didn't feel like exile anymore. It felt like a pause. A space I could use. If they wanted distance, I could use that distance to move unseen. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had the will. And sometimes that's the most dangerous thing you can give someone you've underestimated. The invitation came as a text from Ethan. Dinner Friday. Come by at 16, no details, no explanation. By Friday evening, I stood outside their front door, listening to the murmur of voices inside. Through the glass, I saw people moving, wine glasses catching the light. It wasn't just dinner, it was a full party. Clarissa greeted me at the door with that bright smile she saved for an audience. "So glad you made it," she said, her eyes already flicking past me toward someone more important. Before I could step inside, she pressed a tray into my hands. "Could you take these to the living room? The guests are dying for more appetizers." I glanced down. A dozen tiny porcelain plates balanced on silver. For a second, I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Her hand lingered on the tray just long enough to make it clear this wasn't a request. The living room was full. Neighbors, Ethan's colleagues, people I didn't know. As I moved between them, I caught fragments of conversation. Stocks? Vacations. The new restaurant downtown. Not one person looked at me as anything more than the woman with the tray. I set the plates down on the coffee table, careful not to spill. The porcelain clinked softly, but the sound felt deafening in my ears. Once, these same people would have greeted me as Marjorie Lane, the business owner, the woman who donated to their school fundraisers. Tonight, I was invisible until I carried something they wanted. Clarissa's laughter floated in from the kitchen. It had that sharp, clear edge, the sound she made when she knew she'd won. When I returned the empty tray, she gave me another. "This one's for the back patio. Don't trip on the steps," she said, as though I'd forgotten how to walk. On the patio, the autumn air felt cooler, but it didn't wash away the sting. I set the glasses down on a side table and straightened, only to find two women watching me. One smiled awkwardly, then leaned toward the other. A whisper, a glance, a laugh. I didn't need to hear the words to know they weren't kind. Inside again, Ethan brushed past me without making eye contact. He was deep in conversation with a man I recognized from the bank. They shook hands, smiled, and I caught only the tail end. Something about streamlining assets. The words landed heavy, even without context. Back in the kitchen, I stood by the counter, my hands resting on the cool granite. I could feel eyes on my back, though no one spoke to me. Clarissa moved past, her perfume strong, her voice sweet as she said, "Make sure the dessert is ready when they ask." Timing is everything? Timing. That was something I understood, and as I stood there, framed in the doorway between their warm laughter and the kitchen's chill, I knew this night would be one I remembered. Not for the humiliation, though there was plenty of that, but because somewhere in this room, the first thread of my answer had already started to form. Clarissa's voice rose above the chatter. "Everyone, dessert is ready?" She appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a cake knife like it was a microphone. "Marjorie baked her famous lemon cake for us," she announced. Her tone sugared just enough to hide the sting. Every head turned toward me. I hadn't baked a thing. There was no cake. Only the store-bought pastries Clarissa had bought that afternoon. A ripple of confused smiles moved through the crowd. "She's so modest," Clarissa added quickly, setting a white box on the counter. "Would you do the honor, Marjorie? Slice and serve?" The box lid was already open. Inside, the lemon tart was intact, glossy, smelling faintly of the bakery down the street. Clarissa handed me the knife, the steel cool against my palm. Her smile said, "Let's see you refuse." I could have called her out, told them all the truth. But humiliation works best when the target reacts, and I wasn't about to give her that. Instead, I cut perfect slices, placed each on a plate, and handed them out without looking away from her. The guests took their portions, some murmuring thanks, others avoiding eye contact. Clarissa hovered nearby, drinking in the scene. When the last plate was gone, she leaned in, close enough for only me to hear. "See how much easier it is when you cooperate." I didn't answer. Silence was my shield now. But inside, something shifted, not just anger but clarity. Near the fireplace, two men were speaking quietly. One was the banker I'd seen with Ethan earlier. As I carried the last empty plate back to the kitchen, I caught a fragment of their talk. "Transfers already in motion. By next month, she won't." The rest was lost under the clink of glasses, but it was enough to confirm what I'd suspected since Ethan slid those papers toward me. I placed the plate in the sink, the porcelain ringing softly. Clarissa stepped in, brushing imaginary crumbs from her dress. "Thanks for helping, Marjorie. You really shine in the background." Shine in the background. The word settled in me like a dare. I smiled, not the brittle kind she wore, but the slow, steady kind that never reached my eyes. She didn't notice. She'd never learned to read me. By the time coffee was served, I had what I needed: confirmation that something was happening with my accounts, and the knowledge that Clarissa's need to belittle me blinded her to my attention. I was invisible to her in the way a shadow is, always present, but overlooked until it moves. When the evening wound down, I put on my coat and thanked Ethan for inviting me. He nodded without meeting my eyes. Clarissa offered a perfunctory hug, her perfume sweet and sharp. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap, but it cleared my head. I walked to my car slowly, feeling the weight of the night settle into something sharper than shame. Resolve has a way of warming you from the inside out. They thought tonight had been theirs. They were wrong. It had been mine. A quiet ledger of grievances, a whispered piece of information, a reminder that I could still play the long game. And I intended to. If you were in my place, served up as the entertainment at your own family's table, would you have stayed silent or called them out right there? I'd like to hear your answer. The morning after the party, I woke earlier than usual. Not because I couldn't sleep. I'd slept fine, but because the decision had settled in overnight. It was time to stop guessing. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer with my personal files. The familiar envelopes waited, silent witnesses to years of careful record-keeping. I flipped through statements, pausing at anything that felt off. Some balances were lower than I remembered. Not dramatically, but enough to prick the back of my neck. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, always in even amounts, always on the same day of the month. I kept a small notepad beside me, jotting down dates and amounts. Numbers don't lie, but people do, and these numbers were telling me more than Ethan or Clarissa ever would. Around mid-morning, I picked up the phone and dialed the bank. I spoke with a polite young man named Trevor, who confirmed my identity and asked how he could help. "I need to verify some transactions," I said, keeping my voice steady. He read the list back to me, date by date. Each matched the statements in my hand. When I asked about the destination accounts, his tone changed, just slightly but enough. "I'm afraid I can't disclose the full details over the phone, Mrs. Lane. For that, you'd need to come in person." That was all I needed to hear. I thanked him and hung up. At noon, I drove to the branch I'd used for decades. The parking lot was nearly empty, the air crisp with late autumn. Inside, the scent of coffee mingled with the faint tang of printer ink. A receptionist greeted me warmly. She remembered me from the years Frank and I had been regulars. I asked to speak with someone about my accounts, and within minutes, a woman named Carla led me to her office. She closed the door, gesturing for me to sit. "What's going on, Marjorie?" she asked. I explained in broad strokes, just enough to make my concerns clear without betraying too much emotion. She nodded slowly, typing something into her computer. "I can print the transfer records for the last 18 months, she said. The pages emerged from the printer with a mechanical hum. Carla handed them to me, her eyes flicking up as if to gauge my reaction. There it was in black and white, the same dates, the same amounts, and beside each one, a partial account number I didn't recognize. "Do you know who this belongs to?" I asked. Carla hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but I can tell you the account holder's last name matches one you've mentioned." I didn't have to ask which one. "Clarissa." I sat back, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands. 18 months of quiet erosion, done neatly enough to pass under casual notice. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. Carla looked at me carefully. "If you want to take action, there are steps we can start today. but once you do, it won't stay quiet for long. I folded the pages and slid them into my bag. Not yet, I said. She didn't press me. Back in my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just proof but permission to act. I wasn't ready to use it just yet. But I would be. The first real piece of the puzzle was mine now, and I knew exactly where I was going next. At home, I laid the bank printouts across the dining table. The afternoon light slanted in through the blinds, striping the pages in pale gold. I traced each line with my finger, memorizing the rhythm of the theft. Every date, every amount. It was almost elegant in its consistency. I opened the file box from my closet. Inside were deeds, investment agreements, and old account forms Frank and I had kept. Some of the paper had yellowed at the edges, but the signatures were clear. My signature was always deliberate, each letter upright, the loops narrow. Halfway through the stack, I found something that stopped me cold. A transfer authorization form dated 7 months ago. The signature at the bottom bore my name, but it wasn't mine. The loops were too wide, the slant too steep. Someone had tried to mimic me and hadn't bothered to hide the effort. I set it beside a legitimate document and the difference shouted at me? This wasn't carelessness. It was forgery. I remembered Clarissa once boasting at a dinner party about her steady hand when she did calligraphy for wedding invitations. Back then, it had seemed harmless. Now, it looked like practice for something else entirely. The printouts confirmed the forged form's date matched a large transfer. Same month, same amount. It was the missing link I hadn't known to look for. I leaned back in my chair, letting the anger come and go like a wave. It would be so easy to call Ethan, throw the accusation in his face, demand answers. But anger without timing is just noise. And noise was what they wanted from me. Something they could call emotional, unstable, something to undermine my credibility. I slid the forged document into a separate envelope, sealing it like a secret. Then I opened my laptop and searched my email archives. Most of it was ordinary, newsletters, receipts, birthday wishes from old friends. But buried in the folder from last winter, I found an email from my insurance provider confirming a change to my contact address. An address I'd never lived at. A quick search told me it was a P.O. box registered under Clarissa's name. I wrote it down, adding it to the notepad from that morning. A new column, connections. Beneath it, I listed each link. Dates, amounts, forged signatures, false address. The pattern was no longer just numbers. It was a chain, each link pointing straight back to her. Outside, a wind had picked up, rattling the last of the autumn leaves against the windows. It reminded me of something Frank used to say when we faced a problem at the store. You don't pull the thread until you know exactly how long it is. Then you pull once, and the whole thing unravels. I closed the file box and locked it. The forged form and the bank printout stayed on the table, a private constellation only I could read. Looking at them, I felt the strange calm that comes when fear has somewhere to go. They thought I was standing still. In reality, I was charting every move. By the time the clock struck 6, the table was clear, the envelope hidden in a place only I knew. Dinner could wait. I had something far more important to feed. Patience. The game had shifted. I wasn't just holding proof anymore. I was holding the opening move. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, the forged signature and the bank printouts replaying behind my eyes like a film I couldn't pause. Each detail glowed sharp in the dark. The loop of the G. That wasn't mine. The steady line of numbers siphoning away pieces of my life. The house was quiet except for the tick of the clock in the hallway. Frank used to say the sound was comforting. Now it felt like a metronome counting down to something I hadn't named yet. I got up, wrapped a robe around me, and went to the kitchen. The light over the sink was soft, the kind that doesn't demand conversation. I made tea, not because I wanted it, but because the act gave my hands something to do. Leaning against the counter, I thought about Frank. I remembered him behind the register at the shop, sleeves rolled up, telling me, people will take what you let them take. The trick is knowing when to stop letting. Back then, I thought he meant customers haggling over pottery. Now I understood he meant life. The bitterness in my chest wasn't just about the money. It was about the way they'd made me small in my own story. The dinner trays, the false smiles, the whispered deals in rooms I wasn't meant to enter. I carried my tea to the living room and sat in Frank's old chair. The fabric was worn at the arms where his hands had rested, and for a moment I closed my eyes and imagined his voice. You've still got the edge, Marge. You just stopped using it? That edge, it had dulled, yes, but it wasn't gone. I could feel it now, sharpening with every beat of my heart. They thought my silence was surrender. It wasn't. It was storage. On the coffee table lay my notepad from earlier, the one with the list of connections. I flipped it open, letting my eyes run over the neat columns. Every date, every amount, every link to Clarissa. It was all there, waiting to be turned into something more than a record. Waiting to become a weapon. I started jotting notes in the margin. Not plans, not yet, just fragments. Names of people I trusted, places they didn't know I still had ties to, skills I hadn't used in years but could call on again if I had to. The hours passed without me noticing. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the branches against the siding. It was the kind of night that could make you feel alone in the world. But I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, not by them, but by Frank's memory, by the version of myself that had built a business from nothing and kept it afloat when everyone said it would sink. By the time the clock struck 4, the tea had gone cold and my pen had run out of ink. The notepad lay open, the last line underlined twice of "Nothing stays hidden forever." I closed the book and set it aside. The plan wasn't formed yet, but the center of it was already beating like a heart. It was only a matter of time before it started moving my hands. By mid-morning, I was still in my robe, the notepad from last night open on the kitchen table. The columns of names and dates no longer felt like scattered thoughts. They were starting to line up, like soldiers waiting for orders. I poured fresh coffee and read through each entry, forcing myself to see them as pieces, not just wounds. The forged signature, the false address, the steady withdrawals. Each one was a doorway, and I needed to decide which to walk through first. Instinct told me to confront Clarissa immediately, to watch her face when I laid the proof in front of her. But that would give her time to clean up whatever trail I hadn't found yet. No, my move had to be quiet and visible, like the way she'd done it to me. I circled 2 names on the list, people I trusted who owed me nothing but truth. One was an old friend from my days running the shop, good with paperwork, better with people. The other worked in a place where records lived longer than memories. I didn't call them yet. I needed the timing right. Instead, I focused on the simplest step, securing what was still mine. I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a folder with property deeds, rental agreements, and a separate account that no one, not even Ethan, knew existed. I checked the balances. Untouched. It was a relief, but also a reminder they'd been aiming elsewhere for now, but if they sensed resistance, nothing would be safe. The phone rang just then, breaking the stillness. Caller ID Ethan. I let it go to voicemail. His voice came through the machine, casual but edged with something I couldn't name. Hey, Mom. Just checking in. Call me when you get a chance. I wrote down the time of the call beside today's date. Everything went into the record now, every word, every contact, no matter how harmless it seemed. Around noon, I dressed and sat by the window, coffee in hand, watching the street. The world outside moved at its usual pace. Delivery trucks, neighbors walking dogs, kids on bikes. No one could see that inside this house, a quiet war was being mapped. Frank's voice floated back to me from years ago. You don't have to shout to win, Marge. You just have to be the last one standing. I thought about that as I slid the forged document, the bank printouts, and my notepad into a lockbox. The key went on a chain around my neck, tucked under my shirt. It felt heavy, but not burdensome, more like armor. Before I closed the blinds for the night, I looked once more at the street. Somewhere out there. Clarissa thought she was safe, thought she'd written me into a corner I couldn't escape. But corners can be doors if you know where to push. The plan wasn't perfect yet, but it didn't have to be. It only had to be real enough to start. Tomorrow I would take the first step. And when I did, they wouldn't hear it coming. I didn't wait for the perfect moment. Morning light was enough. The plan had lived in my head long enough. It was time to let it breathe. I started with the smallest lock I could change. My online banking password had been the same for years, a relic from when Frank and I thought security questions were enough to keep anyone out. Now I replaced it with a string of words only I would know. A phrase from a book I'd loved since childhood, one I'd never mentioned to anyone. Next came the accounts Ethan and Clarissa knew existed but had no control over. I set up alerts for any activity, sending them only to my private email. It felt like sliding an extra bolt across the door. By mid-morning, I was on the phone with Carla at the bank. I told her I wanted to add a call verification only note to all my files. No changes, no transfers, no access without my voice on the line. She agreed without hesitation. Do you want me to note specific names to deny? She asked. I said, and I gave her two. It wasn't lost on me that I was effectively building a wall. But this was my house, my life. If they wanted in, they'd have to scale it, and I'd see them coming. Around noon, I drove to the property management office that handled my rentals. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, smiled when she saw me. Marjorie, what brings you in? I need to update my emergency contacts, I said. I removed Ethan's number from every file, replacing it with that of an old friend who'd never met Clarissa. The change took 10 minutes, but the relief was immediate. For 18 months, they'd been moving pieces without me. Today, I'd move some back. On the way home, I stopped at the post office. The clerk there had been around long enough to remember when Frank and I mailed pottery catalogs by hand. I asked her to redirect any mail addressed to my full name to my P.O. box. No exceptions. If Clarissa had set up a box in my name, she'd find it strangely empty from now on. Back at home, I made lunch and sat at the kitchen table, eating slowly, almost ceremonially. Every bite felt like reclaiming something small but vital. The list in my notepad now had neat check marks beside 4 items. 4 steps in one morning. 4 ways they'd find the ground shifting under them without knowing why. The phone rang again. Ethan. I let it ring. I imagined him telling Clarissa I wasn't picking up, the seed of frustration already planted. Frustration makes people sloppy. Sloppy people make mistakes. Before the afternoon was over, I made one more call to my insurance provider. I confirmed my address, my phone number, my beneficiary list. No changes had been made since the false address months ago. Still, I added a passcode to my file. The agent on the other end was cheerful, unaware she'd just handed me another layer of armor. By the time the sun began to dip, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because the danger was gone. It wasn't. But because I'd stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. Every quiet adjustment, every closed door, was a thread pulled from the web Clarissa had woven. I locked the notepad and documents back in the box, the key warm against my skin. Step 1 was done. The rest would follow, one silent move at a time. The next morning I woke before the alarm. The air felt different, not lighter but clearer, like the fog had finally lifted. I brewed coffee and opened my notepad, scanning the unchecked items. Today's steps would be trickier. These weren't locks I could change with a phone call. They were roots I'd need to pull without shaking the tree. First was the storage unit. Frank and I had kept it for decades, a place where business records and valuable inventory sat untouched. The lease was under my name, but Ethan had a spare key. I drove there just after opening, before anyone else was around. The manager, a man who'd known me since Frank's time, greeted me warmly. I asked to change the lock. No questions, no forms, just a new key in my hand and the old one dropped into the office shred bin. Inside the unit, everything was as we'd left it. Boxes stacked, labeled in my handwriting. I took a quick inventory, checking for anything missing. Nothing. Still, I moved the most important files into 2 locked containers and marked them with nondescript labels. If anyone ever did get in, they'd find nothing worth taking. Back home, I called my attorney, a woman I'd trusted for years. I told her I wanted to review my will and update certain clauses. We set a meeting for the following week. I didn't mention Clarissa or Ethan by name. It was too soon for the details, but the seed was planted. By midday, I was at the title office for one of my rental properties. I requested copies of all current records, double-checking every signature. No discrepancies this time, but I paid for certified copies anyway. They'd be harder to dispute if the time came. I ended the afternoon with a visit to the credit union, where I kept a smaller account. One I'd used for personal expenses no one tracked. I shifted a modest sum into it from my main account, enough to cover several months of bills. The teller smiled as she handed me the receipt, unaware she'd just insulated me from whatever accidental freezes might come. Throughout the day, I answered Ethan's texts with short, polite replies. Busy today. We'll call soon. The no hints, no edge in my tone. If anything, I sounded softer than usual. Soft keeps people from looking too closely. The final step came just before sunset. I logged into the shared online account for the family's vacation fund, something Ethan had insisted on managing years ago. It wasn't a large sum, but Clarissa had treated it like her personal travel wallet. I transferred the entire balance into a new account in my name only, then closed the original. The system prompted me to leave a note for other account holders. I typed just 3 words, administrative consolidation complete, It was vague enough to pass as routine, but specific enough to keep them from arguing without revealing the truth. I sat back in my chair, the glow from the screen washing over me. Somewhere, probably within the hour, Clarissa would check the balance and find it gone. She'd have no idea that the vacation fund was just the first of many doors closing quietly behind her. When I shut the laptop, the house felt still again. Not empty, never empty, but aligned. Step 2 of the plan was complete, and the path ahead was no longer just an idea. It was a map I could follow with my eyes closed. They wouldn't hear the locks turning. They'd just wake up one day and find themselves outside. I chose the date the way a jeweler chooses a stone, slowly, carefully, holding it up to the light. It had to be a weekday, when offices were open but distractions were few. And it had to be soon enough that Clarissa and Ethan wouldn't sense the shift in the air. The night before, I sat at my dining table with the notepad and a fresh cup of coffee. Each task had its own number, its own line, its own contact person. Change account access, redirect remaining mail, sign updated property agreements, close shared utilities. Every move arranged in an order that left no gap for them to slip through. I'd already confirmed the times. Bank first, then the property management office, then the insurance meeting. The afternoon would belong to the lawyer. By evening, the circle would be closed. Frank used to say, "Do it all in one breath, Marge. That way, they can't stop you halfway." I could almost hear him across the table, that mix of pride and warning in his voice. It steadied me more than the coffee did. To anyone else, the list might have looked like errands. But to me, it was a sequence, precise, surgical. One wrong step, and the rest might unravel. That's why I'd rehearsed it in my head all week, walking myself through each office door, each handshake, each signature. I prepared the documents that would travel with me: forged form, bank printouts, certified property copies, proof of identity, letters of instruction for each institution. They went into a leather folder Frank had given me years ago. He'd called it the keeper of things that matter. It felt right to carry it tomorrow. The phone rang around 8. Ethan again. This time I answered, keeping my voice warm. We talked about the weather, about a neighbor's new dog. Not a word about money or accounts or anything that lived on my notepad. When we hung up, I knew he suspected nothing. Before bed, I walked through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the frames of photographs. This wasn't just where I lived. It was where I'd rebuilt myself after Frank died. And no one was going to shrink that down to a corner I was allowed to stand in. I placed the leather folder by the front door, my keys on top. Tomorrow, I would leave early and come back late. And when I returned, the ground beneath them would already have shifted. The clock on the wall ticked steady. I turned off the lights, letting the dark fold around me. The work was ready. Now all that was left was to breathe in and wait for morning. I left the house before the sun had fully risen, the leather folder tucked under my arm like a shield. The air was cool, crisp enough to wake every nerve in my body. Today wasn't a day for hesitation. The bank opened at 9, but I was already waiting in the parking lot by 8:45. I sat in the car, reviewing my notes one last time, each step bolded in my mind. This was the first cut, the one that would set the tone for the rest of the day. When the doors unlocked, I was the first inside. Carla, the branch manager, recognized me instantly. "Morning, Marjorie." "You're early. Got a few things to take care of?" I said, smiling as if this were any other errand. In her office, I laid out the requests in the same calm voice I'd practiced. Add multi-step verification to every account. Remove all secondary access regardless of name. Place a permanent hold on any outgoing transfers above a set limit without my direct, in-person approval. Carla's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Do you want me to notify the other parties on file?" "No," I said. "They'll find out when they need to." She didn't ask more? We'd known each other long enough for her to trust the weight in my tone. She clicked through screens, printed forms, and slid them across the desk. I signed each one deliberately, my pen steady. Every signature felt like reclaiming a fraction of myself they'd been siphoning away. We moved on to the safe deposit box account. I changed the authorization so only my signature would open it. If Ethan or Clarissa had ever thought about checking its contents, that door was now shut. When it was done, Carla handed me a folder with stamped confirmations. "All set. Effective immediately." Those words landed heavy in the best way. I thanked her and stood to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Carla, if anyone calls about my accounts, please transfer them directly to me, even if it's family." She nodded without hesitation. Back in the car, I let the engine idle for a moment. Through the windshield, I saw people moving in and out of the bank, unaware that something irreversible had just happened inside. Somewhere, a thread tying me to Clarissa's control had just been cut clean. The leather folder sat on the passenger's seat, a little thicker now with today's victories. I glanced at the clock, still early. Plenty of time for the next move. I pulled out of the lot, the morning sun catching the edge of the folder's brass clasp. The day was far from over, but the first wall had been built, and I was still standing on the inside. From the bank, I drove straight to the property management office. The receptionist looked up from her desk, her smile warm. "Marjorie, here for your inspection report." "Not today," I said. "I need to update my files." We sat together in a small side office. One by one, I reviewed every property account. Ethan's number disappeared from the contact lists, replaced with a landline only I answered. Clarissa's name, added without my consent months ago, was struck off entirely. Each change was printed, signed, and stamped before being slipped into my leather folder. Before leaving, I made one more request. "Any maintenance issues, call me directly. No exceptions." The manager nodded, pen in hand, and I could feel another layer of my life shifting back into place. By noon, I was at the insurance office. The waiting room was nearly empty, the air faintly humming with fluorescent light. When my agent appeared, she ushered me into her office with practiced efficiency. I asked for a full review of all my policies: home, auto, rental. We confirmed my address, my beneficiary list, and then added a passcode that only I knew. "Without this code," I said, "no changes are allowed, not even if they have my ID." Her eyes sharpened, but she simply typed it in and pressed save. I walked out into the afternoon sun, feeling the day's weight shifting from my shoulders to the leather folder. It was heavier now. Documents, confirmations, proof of boundaries redrawn. The final stop was my lawyer's office. We'd met last week to outline the updates. Today was for signatures. She greeted me with a handshake that lingered just long enough to say she understood. At her desk, she spread out the pages: revised will, updated property assignments, letters of instruction to be enacted only at my request. As I signed each document, I felt the click of doors closing. Not the slam of anger, but the measured shut of a lock that would hold. When we finished, she slid the stack into a sealed envelope. "These are yours," she said. "Keep them where only you can reach them." Well, I placed the envelope carefully into my folder. That folder, I realized, had become more than a container. It was a record of survival. By late afternoon, I was back in my car, the city moving around me as if nothing had happened. Yet in less than a day, every thread Clarissa and Ethan had woven into my life had been cut or tied beyond their reach. I didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't gloating. It was reclaiming. But as I turned into my driveway, I felt something I hadn't in months: certainty. The kind that settles into your bones and tells you you're standing on solid ground again. I locked the folder in its place at home, the key warm against my skin. The work was done. They wouldn't realize it until too late, and by then, the doors would be closed forever. The first sign came 2 days later. A text from Ethan: "Hey, did you change the vacation fund account?" I read it, set the phone down, and let the quiet stretch. An hour later, another. "Clarissa says it's missing. Call me." I didn't. That evening, my phone lit up again. This time a call. I answered on the third ring, my tone steady. "Hi, Ethan." "Mom, the account's gone." "What happened?" "I consolidated my finances," I said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Silence on the other end. Then a sharp inhale. "Clarissa's really upset," she says. "I'm sure she is." I cut in. "But this isn't her concern." Before he could argue, I added, "I need to go. Dinner's on the stove." And I ended the call. The next morning brought a knock at my door. I knew before opening it who it would be. Clarissa stood there, arms crossed, her expression polished but tight. "Marjorie, we need to talk." I stepped aside just enough for her to enter. She sat at the edge of the couch, knees angled toward the door. "I couldn't access the property manager yesterday. My name's off the file." "Why?" I met her gaze evenly. "Because I'm the property owner, and I prefer to handle my affairs directly." Her lips tightened. "That's not how families work." "That's exactly how mine works," I replied, my voice low and calm. She stared at me, perhaps waiting for a crack. When none came, she stood. "This feels hostile." "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said, and walked her to the door. For the rest of the day, my phone buzzed off and on. Missed calls from Ethan. 2 voicemails, both starting measured and ending with clipped frustration. I didn't respond. Instead, I went about my errands: grocery store, library, a stop at the post office to pick up redirected mail. The ordinary rhythm of the day felt like armor. By evening, another message arrived. "We need access to manage things, Mom." This isn't right. I read it twice, then deleted it without replying. Not out of spite, out of choice. Engaging now would give them room to maneuver. Silence kept the walls intact. That night, I sat at the kitchen table sipping tea, the leather folder beside me. Every document, every signature from the one-day cutoff was there, solid and unmovable. They could knock, they could call, they could press from every side, but the structure would hold. Some might call it cold. I called it calm, the kind you earn after months of being pushed into a corner and finally stepping back into the center of your own life. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, porch lights blinking on one by one. I watched them from the window, my reflection steady in the glass. Let them rage, let them scheme. I'd built this stillness brick by brick, and I wasn't about to give it away. On the third day, Ethan showed up unannounced. He didn't knock gently, 3 hard raps that rattled the glass in the door. I opened it to find him standing with Clarissa at his side, both wearing the same tight expression. "Mom, we're coming in," he said, already stepping past me. Clarissa followed, her perfume trailing sharp and sweet. They took the couch without waiting for an invitation. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "This has gone too far. You've cut us out of everything, bank accounts, properties, even the insurance. What's going on?" I sat in my chair across from them, hands folded in my lap.
What's going on?
I said evenly, "Is that I'm managing my life the way I see fit." Clarissa's laugh was short, brittle. "That's not how families operate. We're supposed to share responsibilities." "You mean?" I said. "You're supposed to have access to what's mine." Her eyes narrowed. Ethan shifted in his seat. "That's not fair, Mom." "What wasn't fair," I said, "was forging my signature or removing me from my own accounts. I'm correcting that." Silence filled the room. The weight of my words settled between us, heavy enough to keep them still. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Clarissa tried another tack. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We can work something out, Doubt." "I've already worked it out," I said, "and it's not up for negotiation." The edge in my voice stopped her mid-breath. She looked at Ethan, searching for an ally, but found none. He stared at the floor, his hands clasped tight. "You're pushing us away," she said finally. "I'm setting boundaries," I replied. "If that feels like distance, it's because you've been standing too close to what doesn't belong to you." For a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan stood, his movements deliberate. "Fine. If that's how you want it." "It is," I said. They walked to the door, Clarissa pausing with her hand on the knob. "You'll regret this," she said. I met her gaze without blinking. "I doubt it." When the door closed behind them, the house was silent again. Not the tense silence of waiting for the next blow, but the steady kind that follows a storm. I went to the window and watched them cross the driveway to their car. Neither looked back. Good. They didn't need to. The message was already delivered, and it wasn't in my words. It was in every locked account, every updated file, every wall I'd built. Back at the kitchen table, I poured myself a glass of water, the coolness steadying my hands. For months, I'd lived with the sense of being surrounded, pressed on all sides. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was space to breathe. They would try again, maybe. But it wouldn't matter. The foundations were set, and I was standing on solid ground. I looked at the leather folder on the table. Inside was the story of how I'd taken my life back, page by page, signature by signature. And no one, not Clarissa, not even Ethan, could touch it now. The day wasn't remarkable to anyone else, but to me it was the day they understood the door had closed, and it wasn't opening again. 2 weeks after the last conversation with Ethan and Clarissa, I packed my car. No rush, no panic, just the slow, deliberate gathering of what I truly needed. Clothes, my old pottery tools, a box of books, and the leather folder. Everything else could wait. I drove north, leaving the adobe walls of Santa Fe behind. The mountains rose in the distance, their slopes still dusted with the last of winter's snow. By midday, I reached the edge of a small town I'd only visited once years ago. It felt right the moment I rolled down the windows and caught the scent of pine. The cabin I'd rented sat on a quiet lane, its porch facing a narrow stream. Inside, the rooms were simple. Wood floors, stone fireplace, shelves just waiting for clay pots and bowls. I set my things down and stood for a long moment, listening to the stillness. It didn't feel empty. It felt like space I could fill on my own terms. That first evening, I walked into town. The main street was only a few blocks long, lined with small shops and cafes. A woman at the bakery counter smiled as I ordered tea. "You're new here," she said, not as a question but as a welcome. I smiled back. "Just arrived?" Back at the cabin, I pulled out my notebook, not the one filled with evidence and plans, but a fresh one. On the first page, I wrote, "Community Pottery Workshop, free for women starting over." The idea had been with me for years, buried under other people's needs and demands. Now, there was nothing stopping me. Over the next days, I visited the local community center, the library, even the small farmers market to ask about space. Everyone I spoke to was encouraging. One woman said, "We've never had anything like that here. You'll have a wait list in no time." In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, listening to the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. The quiet wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of peace. I could feel it settling into me, smoothing the sharp edges that months of tension had carved. One night, I opened the leather folder and took out a single page, the updated will. I smiled reading the clause I'd added, "A portion of my estate to fund the workshop after I'm gone." It wasn't about them anymore, or what they'd tried to take. It was about what I could give. Here, in this little town, surrounded by mountains and pine, I wasn't someone's mother or target. I was simply Marjorie Lane, with clay on her hands and a future she'd shaped herself. The workshop opened on a Saturday morning, sunlight spilling through the tall windows of the community center. I'd borrowed tables from the library, set out wheels and tools, and arranged lumps of clay at each seat. The air smelled faintly of earth and fresh coffee from the corner table. One by one, they arrived. 12 women, most in their 40s and 50s, a few older. Some came alone, others with a friend in tow. Each carried the quiet weight of her own story, loss, reinvention, a need to try something new. We began simply. I showed them how to wedge the clay, pressing out air bubbles, feeling the texture shift under their palms. Hands moved hesitantly at first, then more surely. Laughter began to mingle with the sound of spinning wheels. At the break, we gathered around the coffee table. One woman, Carla, told us she'd moved here after her husband passed, looking for a place where I wasn't just the widow. Another, Janine, said she'd left a job she hated and wanted to make something she could actually hold in her hands. I listened, nodding, recognizing the echoes of my own path in each voice. By the end of the session, the tables were filled with uneven bowls, small vases, and mugs that leaned slightly to one side. But in every piece, I saw care, intention, beginnings. As we cleaned up, several women asked when the next class would be. "Every Saturday," I said. "And the only cost is showing up." The smiles that followed were worth more than any check I'd ever written. That night back at the cabin, I sat by the fire with a mug of tea. The day replayed in my mind, not in sharp snapshots like the months before, but in soft, flowing moments. The way Janine laughed when her vase collapsed. The way Carla's hands steadied as she found her rhythm. I reached for the leather folder, now tucked on the lower shelf. It had been my armor once, the record of how I took my life back. Now it was just a reminder of the strength it took to reach this place, and the choice to use that strength for something better. Looking out the window, the mountains were dark against a sky scattered with stars. I thought about the women who would sit at those wheels in the weeks to come, shaping clay into something new, shaping themselves, too. This was my legacy, not the properties, not the accounts, but the quiet space I'd built where others could start again. If you're listening and you've ever felt erased, know this, you're not alone. You can draw the line, take back your life, and shape something beautiful from what's left. I did. And so can you.